I think recruiting's a funny business where, sometimes it's more about the transaction than it is about the insight. And I think if you're really talking about the talent advisor role, it's got to be about the insight and not the transaction.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm Johnny Campbell, CEO and co-founder of Social Talent. And this week on the podcast, we're talking with Brian Ivay from Ciena. He's joining us from Canada to talk about the importance of business acumen in recruiting, particularly in a world where talent advisors are going to be the only recruiters, arguably, that we'll need when AI is doing everything else for us. Before we dig into the topic, Brian, you're really welcome to the show. It is wonderful to have you here. I'm hoping maybe you could introduce yourself to our audience, tell us a little bit your career, even where you're joining us from today.
Yeah. Thank you, Johnny. Good to be here. Little bit about my background. I started out as an agency recruiter more years ago than I care to admit. I think it was in the late 90s, so sort of in the .com era, I suppose. Started out in agency recruiting, and very quickly after a few years of doing that, jumped into more of a corporate recruiting role, and have been sort of riding that corporate wave since then, specifically in the telecom equipment and high tech markets. I've kind of dabbled in and out of recruiting since that time. I've served a long time as a business partner, and more recently in the last few years, I've come back to leading a recruiting function. So, I've got a lot of different perspective on the topic for sure.
Tell us about Ciena. A lot of our audience may not be familiar with the brand, the business. Maybe walk us through the industry, the sector. What do you guys do? The company, type of skills you hire for.
Yeah, no, listen, this is a good question. I mean, I get it all the time. And it's mysterious a little bit, but I hopefully it can maybe demystify it. But um, Sienna fundamentally builds the infrastructure upon which the internet runs. And our core area of expertise is in um, photonic and optical long haul transmission of data. And that manifests itself into a lot of different types of systems and products. But if you think of, um, the traditional service provider industry, which is um, your AT&Ts and your Verizons, et cetera. We build the networks that those companies run on. And more recently, in the last number of years, we're working more in the cloud provider space and building the network infrastructure that the cloud companies are running on. And of course, now with the advent of AI, we're looking at how does the coherent optics fit into the data center, and all of the sort of advent of technology in that space. So it's really long haul, mass quantity of data over long distances that we do. That's our specialty. Yeah.
I was fascinated when I realized you built the infrastructure for undersea optical cables, the kind of stuff that's laid across the Atlantic, that technology. I believe that's part of Ciena's product set. Would
Yeah,
that be right?
yeah. Submarine's a huge part of our business, and it's interesting because until 10 years ago, that wasn't something that we were necessarily a big part of. Um, but yeah, a lot of the subsea networks that run sort of between Asia and Europe and North America, we don't lay the actual transmission lines, the optical fiber. That's not our business. But what we do run is the equipment that pushes the data across those lines, and that is our expertise. And so, particularly in Europe, that is a Europe in the Middle East and in Asia, that's a very big business for us. And yeah, I mean, if you're running, this conversation right now, I'm sitting in Canada and you're sitting in Ireland, uh, you know, that's happening over subsea networks for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And Brian, the business is what, 9,000 people. What size TA team do you have? What kind of volume hiring you doing? What locations? What type of skills?
Yeah, so we're global. We're in about 32 countries globally, 35 countries globally. Predominantly, we're located in the U.S. and Canada. Our R&D headquarters are where I'm based out of in Ottawa, but we've got a big R&D presence in Gurgaon in India. So big site there. And our corporate headquarters in the US. And we've got offices in London, and London, India, um, obviously a number of sites in the US as well. So global. We're about 28 folks in the global TA team, and supporting a business that's about $4 billion, of which we've got about 8,500 employees, and depending on whether you count students and that or not, students and early in career is a big part of our mandate from a recruiting standpoint. Um, we're driving. I mean, the volume fluctuates, as we all know in the recruiting business. It's different from year to year depending on what's happening, but we're driving about 1,500 hires a year on average. And the skill sets that we hire for are quite varied and quite distributed, frankly. You know, our core business is obviously around the technology, around research and development and R&D, and those are highly technical semiconductor design, sort of ASIC and FPGA design type roles, which is a very high demand skill set right now. Sort of, of course, with everything that's going on in AI, it's all built, not only the actual processing, but the transmission and storage is all around the semiconductor business, which is why we've seen so much, growth for around, the GPU and that sort of thing. So those are a real important skill set that we hire for. But, we do everything from, customer care to, of course, sales and sales engineering and the different go-to-market forms that we've got. So, and we do that, our team has to do that across, multi locations and multi regions. Yeah.
Brian, I ask every guest about their business, their structure, their teams, their locations, what they do. And it's not an accident. I've always been fascinated by businesses, how companies work, what they look like, what they do, how they make money. I used to, we were commenting before we went on air that myself and you started in recruiting in the same summer back when God was a child. And, back then I used to get kicked out of interview rooms, or people try and kick me out of the interview rooms in the agency I worked in because I was there too long. Because I was recruiting accountants at the time, and I'd ask them about the business, how does it work? And I was actually this morning driving through a town near me called Nace, and I was remembering being there with a colleague 25 years ago doing a client meeting. I used to do client meetings all the time. I visited the Heinz factory in Dundalk to see how they make ready-made meals. I remember Moffat Engineering, who make forklifts on the back of trucks up in Monaghan, drove to Monaghan to see how they make forklifts. I would go anywhere that would have me. Coca-Cola's bottling plant outside Dundalk, I visited as well to see how they do. Coca-Cola bottlers bottle Coca-Cola and set it on, or make the syrup. And then that was one factory. The bottling was a different place. I literally went to all these places. I was constantly at client meetings. I was recruiting in industry, and I was the top bidder in my team. And I still find it fascinating to understand how a business operates. I think you're someone who shares that view. And, I would call that business acumen, that kind of understanding or the desire to want to know how it all connects, rather than just saying, show me the job spec and tell me what you need to hire for. I'd absolutely start big picture. What is the business? What do you do? How does it work? How is it organized? And I'd eventually get to the job. What's your journey with regard to business acumen? Was that your journey as a recruiter? Were you that kind of same recruiter who just had this desire and interest? Or, tell me your story.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I don't know that anybody sets out in life to become a recruiter or go into human resources or people and culture. I don't know how many, it seems to be a rare thing. But, interestingly, growing up, I was always sort of interested in how business worked. And I had this inherent curiosity about how a small business made money. And in fact, that's what I went to school for. I went to school for finance and small business management. And that was just something I thought I was going to end up doing. But the principles of a business, whether it's small or large, are basically based on all the same premise. I mean, accounting works one way, whether you like it or not. How a company is financed works one way. It's just the scale that changes, gets more complex. But I guess, for me, it's just probably more in this. I'm just sort of got this curiosity about it, and it's just that sort of. I just want to know. I don't know why. I just keep asking questions, and I just want to know. And maybe it's the business background a little bit that drives that. but it's more that I'm just like, I want to understand. I've got the questions just seem to come out of me, and I just want to know what's going on and why we do things certain ways, or why it works the way it is. And it's just, I think curiosity is such a huge thing around business acumen and developing that sort of um, capability. Is you've got to be willing to ask questions and go in places that you wouldn't necessarily need to go to just get the job done, but you're doing it because you're trying to expand your own
Mhm.
uh, just your own knowledge of a topic. And, um, having that sort of curiosity goes an awful long way in expanding business acumen. To me, it's a starting point. Is you've got to really be interested in understanding, you know, how does the economics of a semiconductor work? Like, how does that actually operate in terms of, and what I mean economics of the semiconductor, I mean like how many can you sell, but the constant sort of battle around consumption of power, uh, the size of the semiconductor itself, like that, those things are super interesting to me. Not because I want to be an engineer, but I just want to understand why it is that there's a demand for this from a customer that will spend so much money on it. Like, why on earth would somebody want to do this? When you understand sort of the economics behind it, it's super interesting. So, yeah, I think business acumen could also be economics acumen as well, in sort of micro macroeconomics and just understanding how things kind of work. But yeah, it comes back to curiosity. I think for me, it's just sort of inherent desire to want to know more. This thing we call business acumen. Yeah.
I say in 2025, when I talk to recruiting leaders or organizations about the skills that the recruiters want to learn in
Yeah.
2025, there's two buckets, right? And they're intertwined. One is teach me how to use AI. My team need to use AI more. We need to use AI more. We're putting more AI products in, et cetera, et cetera. And then the call it sister of that is we need to upskill on soft skills, because if we're going to bring AI in to do lots of different things, what are we doing as recruiters? And there's a category of skills, often called soft or human skills, but within that, there's usually the same list of skills. Negotiation skills, we want to, build those. We want presentation skills. We want influencing skills. But top of the list is business acumen. And we hear it from our customers, and we've heard it for several years. And it's a big topic. People are talking about it. But when I ask folks, what do they mean by business acumen? Very few can articulate it. You've begun to scratch at it. But what would you say business acumen is? If you were to define it, if you were to do what we had to do in Social Talent Prime, which was to write a curriculum on it, because we're launching our new mini MBA for recruiters this month. We had to write this down and decide, shoot, what are we going to actually teach people? To
Mm.
you, what does business acumen mean? If you were to lay it out, and you were to write down a list of bullet points of things you need to know at the end of this business acumen course for recruiters, what exactly is that?
Yeah, I think it's really clear to me what that means. And there's kind of two pieces of it, fundamentally. I mean, the first part is, kind of what I referenced earlier, which is, do you really understand how a business operates? Like, how is it financed? Um, what's the product? What's the cost of the product? What is the demand for the product? What is the supply? How do you build it? How do you get it to the market? How do you get it to your customer? How do you understand how all the different pieces of a business, whether it's, a corner store or a bagel shop, or whether it's, you know, a massive telecommunications company that's, producing very complex systems and selling them to very complex customers, who are in turn selling very complex services to their customers. It's understanding all those little pieces of how the business is put together, um, and getting the exposure to the product, and understanding how it goes to the customer, how it's built, how the accounting works around it. That's the one piece of it. That's sort of the core. Just how does a business work? And that's kind of what maybe a micro MBA almost, is understanding the basics of that. The other part of it is, okay, so let's assume you've got that sort of fundamental of, I understand, debits and credits, and how a product is built or a service is marketed, or what have you. And there's sort of economics that are part of that as well. The other side of it is, okay, now that you're actually working inside of a business, and that could be, hey, I'm supporting an R&D organization on hiring ASIC engineers. I'm working with a sales team around hiring sales engineers and account managers, whether I'm hiring, a product marketing person for the marketing team. It's then immersing yourself in that context, in that business, to understand, okay, so what are we really trying to achieve within that function that's part of this bigger business? How does it contribute to either, you know, customer success or the bottom line or the top line of the company? And then what's the market for that? So within the context of, you know, not only the employment piece of it in the recruiting market, but it's also the actual, how are they competing amongst their peers, whether it's, what's happening in the marketing world, what's happening in the R&D world, what's happening in the sales world. Having that sort of understanding of the challenges within the market of the function that you're recruiting for makes you a better recruiter. And so if you couple that with the sort of what I'll call fundamental micro MBA understanding of how a business works, with sort of the market concept of the function that you're working and recruiting in, you then can engage in actual business conversations, not hiring conversations. And so you bring credibility to the function that you're recruiting in, because you've got an understanding of what's happening in and around that business that those leaders, frankly, managers are struggling with every day. But you're bringing a very specific recruiting lens to that conversation, and it makes you very, as a recruiter, it makes you very valuable in terms of, where are the people that we should be bringing in, either reactively or proactively, to sort of disrupt things. It makes you, interestingly enough, something that we do at Ciena, and we've been starting to do this year, is partnering with our corporate development teams. And this is when we're looking at a market to go out and recruit, say, a semiconductor skill set, or a hardware engineering skill set, our corporate development teams are looking at that same sort of market segment from an M&A standpoint. So you can partner with, a group like that internally to help understand, where's the skill set in the marketplace? What are the companies that we should be looking at? How should we be thinking about approaching those markets? How should we be thinking about going after the talent in those businesses and in those companies? So business acumen to me has got to be both things. You've got to have the fundamental, how does a business work piece, and then you got to then translate that into, okay, so what does it mean for the group that I'm hiring for, and what's the landscape in which you're working? So anyway, long answer to a basic question, but those to me are the two pieces of business acumen.
I love your framing and your description of it, and the context of its importance, for me, is illustrated by, this advisory role. You talked about being talent advisors, and I know it's a big mission for you around your recruiting team, Brian. But somebody might go into a meeting with a hiring team and make a recommendation, and that recommendation will be heard in different ways depending on the respect that team has for that recruiter. Same advice, somebody who walked in who hasn't demonstrated that any knowledge of the industry, the sector, the business, giving a piece of advice, easy to dismiss. Somebody who's established
Mm.
credibility, can talk the same language of the business, fully understands their strategy, what they're doing, why they're doing things, who makes that recommendation, is going to be heard in a very different way. So I think sometimes we forget this. We look at the pieces like teach you how to be an expert on advising on interview process, teach you how to be an expert on advising on assessment methodology, teach you how to be an expert on advising on sourcing strategy. We forget that if you're giving all this advice, the context in which you give it is your business acumen and your reputation with the team. And if you don't have any, you haven't established it, then you might be expert in all those areas, but no one's going to listen to you because they don't see you as an equal. They don't see that you understand their business, or they perceive that you perhaps don't understand your business, and there's nuances to it. Like, is it, are we just two older guys who say, oh, young people don't do this anymore? Or is there genuine truth to what I hear from folks, which is that recruiters seem to lack this business acumen today, where they didn't maybe lack it as much a few decades ago? Do you have any sort of sense of whether that's truthful? If so, maybe what are the causes of it? Maybe does remote working hamper that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd say I've just met you, but we're definitely two old guys. Uh,
Fair, true.
so I'll agree with that. Yeah, it's interesting, and it's a great question. And the way I think of being in that room is, I think recruiters have got to stop pigeonholing themselves as recruiters. Like,
Mm.
don't limit yourself by this notion of being a recruiter. You've got to think of yourself, or start, I think if you imagine yourself as having a relevant contribution to a business conversation, then you will manifest yourself into that role. Meaning, don't limit yourself to thinking about, hey, my role is in recruiting. No, your job is in, making a contribution to that business that you're supporting. And if you stop limiting yourself in the context of just being a recruiter, and hey, I've got some really interesting things to say about this market or this business that we're trying to run, and I'm thinking about it from a recruiting standpoint, people will want to listen to what you have to say, but you got to put in the hard work to get there. Now,
Mm.
so that's sort of on, being relevant in the room and how do you get there. And I think the quicker you can sort of accept yourself as a legitimate, having a legitimate business perspective and having a legitimate view on things, the more you will inherently, I think, learn about that. But your question about, why do we see that and why don't we see that? It's interesting. I think we've dealt with this notion of what recruiting is for the last 25, 26 years. And, Johnny, I literally remember the filing cabinet. Okay. Like,
Mm.
that's how far I go back. And the stacks of resumes, and you would, keep your file of ASIC engineers under lock and key at night because that was, a treasure trove of information. Um, and we've seen now over the last 25 years, just how much the world has changed with access to information, and the fundamental, what I'll call, stock and trade of the recruiting industry has become data around people, and LinkedIn has obviously become the de facto standard on this. But um the role of the recruiter has really evolved and has really changed in terms of, hey, you know I'm processing data. But to your question about how do how come we haven't seen more of a prevalent evolution of that skill set, I think in a lot of ways those who have that inherent business acumen frankly find other ways to make money. To be honest with you, I think that's a legitimate thing. I think, um if you've got that inherent skill set around business acumen, you are very valuable
Mm.
in an agency context, and less, and frankly, the compensation that we offer in the corporate environment to a recruiter maybe doesn't rationalize that level of business acumen. I think that's a real thing, frankly,
Mm.
Johnny.
Mm.
And I've got a colleague I talk with about this all the time. Is, um, if you've got that level of business context and understanding and the ability to do that kind of work, do you really fit into the traditional pay ranges of a recruiter in a corporate setting? Yeah, it's a good question. Um, but I think for me, when we're bringing in recruiters and we're developing new folks, what we're trying to instill is, hey, be curious, ask the question. Don't worry about the fact that you don't know. Nobody expects you to be an engineer, but people will always be willing to help and answer the question. It's really, how do you get that interest in developing that acumen? And I think recruiting is a funny business where, sometimes it's more about the transaction than it is about the insight. And I think if you're really talking about the talent advisor role, it's got to be about the insight and not the transaction. Well, the great thing is, we're on the precipice of the biggest sort of change in how humans work, not only in recruiting, but anywhere. Like, you've got this sort of advent of AI that presents this massive potential about how we can change what we do every day. And so in terms of becoming less transactional and more insightful, I think there's this great opportunity with AI. And how do we sort of get the recruiter out of that traditional, hey, I'm churning and I'm opening recs and I'm screening, I'm sourcing, I'm interviewing, I'm hiring, I'm offering, and get them more into that. Hey, let's talk about where the competitors are. Let's talk about where the talent is, and let's talk about where you're going versus how do I just, close this rec as fast as I can. So yeah, It's a bunch of things. That's a complicated question, I think, to be honest with you. But for me,
We
it's probably indoctrinating a little bit as they come in.
we like complicated questions, Brian. And I love your insight. Actually, I think that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about the fact that the incentives maybe for someone with strong business acumen aren't to go into corporate recruiting. You know, they're
Yeah,
into
well, I
a
mean, let's
different
be honest
career
with
or
you.
agency.
Yeah, I mean, if I have a recruiter who demonstrates extremely strong business acumen, they actually, interestingly enough, don't stay a recruiter very long
Uh,
in our company.
uh,
They get picked up into other functions. I mean, I'm a case in point. I came to Ciena as a recruiter 15 years ago, and I was very quickly moved into, and I frankly was interested in moving into other parts of the business and inside of our own function. But yeah, it's a legitimate thing. Um,
So,
so anyway, I
so
digress.
it's interesting. Like I look at some of the reasons why maybe we've got here. I've contemplated this over the years and working with, I get the benefit of working with hundreds of teams, seeing how they've structured their teams, see how they look at their education and how they organize work over the last 10, 12 years. And I think recruiting, which used to be a 360-degree thing, and we broke it into, subdivisions of functions and we gave people expert roles, sourcing, business partner, different parts of
Mm,
the job. I think when you broke down the job into smaller pieces, which made sense at scale to do so, you lost sight of the big picture, and business acumen kind of went to the background, and it became you were an expert at a process in a workflow, and maybe that didn't lend itself to needing or encouraging business acumen. I'm remembering back to again early days of recruiting when I was there. Sometimes the people with the best business acumen were people who worked the job who ended up in recruiting. So ex accountants, ex engineers, who someone said, "Hey, you should be a recruiter because your personality is great." And an accountant with personality should be a recruiter of accountants, not an accountant, for example, right? So some of those folks had acumen because they did the job right, and that gave them the acumen, so to speak, as a hack. You and I went to business school, but I found that most recruiters did not go to business school. And, you look at the wave of folks came into recruiting in 21, 22. They largely came in from retail, hospitality. They were in F&B leadership roles. Those folks did not come from that traditional background, and they perhaps want to. So I think there's a desire for this business acumen. I definitely think there's a need. I think the roles of recruiters is leaning more towards these skills, and you'll need to get there, right? And I think everyone wants it. I think the businesses want it for their teams. To your point, maybe every recruiter should want business acumen skills because it makes them more marketable to more jobs and to leadership roles in HR and recruiting, which is it's a win-win for everybody. But aside from just educating, what have you? I'm sure you've thought about this problem, Brian, or maybe you've solved it in some ways. How do you think we can encourage a culture or environment of business acumen or business focus amongst a recruiting team? What are your thoughts? What's your experience in that?
Well, I think you have to value it first of all. I think that's where it starts. Is you've got to demonstrate that you believe there's value in doing that, and so you have to create the environment where your team recognizes that it's an important skill set to have. And then, frankly, the second part of it is you got to reward the behavior. If you're going to do that, if you're going to go down the path of, hey, I recognize that a recruiter with strong business acumen is important, and be really clear on what the outcomes are of them doing that, you can't then in turn look at sort of volume of recruiting or traditional sort of what I'll call recruitment metrics to measure that individual. You've got to really change how you think about how you measure
Mm,
the recruiter impact, and
great
and
point.
that's not easy to do because a lot of it has to do with conversations that they're in.
Mm,
And you know the notion that somebody says, oh, so and so recruiter said something really insightful to me, and it made me change how I think about how I'm going to fill this role. Well, that's not checking the box on closing a rec. That's and it's not as measurable. So you need that feedback loop as how you measure the business acumen piece as opposed to something in a metric or a dashboard that you're tracking all the time. Um, but I think it's largely the starting point is largely, you know, set the context that is a value what you're looking for, and for me it's really setting that goal of the talent advisor, and what that means, and in all its different manifestations. But then it's also rewarding the behavior when you see it, and rewarding the behavior means recognizing it, paying for it, you know, uh, you know, differentiating for it. And frankly, I think when a recruiter is operating in that context, it's very energizing, or at least I think it is. I mean, it's, you're having a real business impact. You're not just sort of checking the box and filling racks. You're actually having a business conversation about what you can do to help move a business forward. So I think probably those are the two big things. And this is a bit of a journey, I think, too, is figuring out how do you also identify people who inherently bring that sort of curiosity that I spoke about earlier. Um, and because the likelihood that somebody with that sort of mindset is going to be successful in a context where business acumen is required is probably higher. I mean, if you're just not that interested in it, then, you can lead a horse to water, but, but I think you've got to look for that inherent interest in sort of developing some curiosity. It's interesting. There's um, a lot of discussion right now about curiosity. It's a bit of a talent strategy buzzword, frankly. How do you identify curiosity? How do you develop it? How do you grow it? Um, and I don't think there's a real silver bullet on that. I think it's having the conversation, it's talking about it, it's recognizing it when you see it. But I don't think you can force somebody. That's one insight that I think I've learned over the last couple of years is that you either and by the way, people have curiosity in all kinds of different ways. And, for me, it happens to be around the business and it happens to be around business acumen. Um, but you can't necessarily force it either. So
I spent a lot of time researching and reading on curiosity, and my take on it is that everybody is innately curious, but to
mm,
your point, different things spark our curiosity.
correct.
And so, therefore, not everyone's going to be curious about how a business works. Some people might be curious about how people feel. They might be
Mm,
curious about what impact things have, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and often the challenge is to spark curiosity by discovering what someone's interest is or what sparks each individual's curiosity and using that to channel their focus area
yeah.
to make them curious, right? Because I think this idea, well, some people are curious and some people aren't, that's nonsense. Like we're all innately curious. It's just that some people couldn't give a monkeys about business, but they're
Yeah.
unbelievably curious about sports, or they're really curious about their community, or they're curious about faith, or they're curious about history. So music, people have a curiosity. It just might not be the same curiosity as you, and that's I think where people get it wrong. But when you think about you mentioned some good ways to encourage it. The KPIs is really interesting. I love that one in terms of making sure that you're creating that culture, showing it's important, showing it through your KPIs, as in not using traditional KPIs that perhaps might go against being a talent advisor. Do you
Mm,
think structure is also something there, Brian? Like, maybe you just have always worked in I call it a positive structure. I know teams, for example, that structured their recruiters around the candidate's skills. And so they didn't optimize recruiters around the business,
mhm.
so recruiters found themselves working with loads of different parts of the business, never the same part of the business twice type of thing, because they focused on a particular skill or a particular geography. And that I have found lends to more knowledge of a skill set for sure. You understand the skill set really well, but your business acumen is poor because you don't work with the same business over and over again. Whereas, if you have sourcers maybe aligned to skill sets, but you have a talent advisor aligned to a business unit or function, so they're always embedded with the same team, always working with that team, solving that team's entire hiring challenges or talent challenges, that you're more likely to have stronger business acumen. Is that something you ever thought about in terms of how you structure teams over the years? That those things, there's positives and negatives to those things.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, you know, I don't have the perfect environment. I'm not gonna I do in terms of developing that, although I've got the aspiration, I suppose. But I think it's very important to give the recruiters the opportunity to see a bunch of different things. and then you've got to allow them to embed themselves at a certain point in a specific function. And getting some breadth of understanding of the business is a good thing. And then maybe at some point, uh, you know, giving them time to delve deeper into a specific function is most important. It takes time to learn a business. It takes time to get invited to the conversations where the discussions are happening. It takes time to develop that credibility. Um, but Johnny, it is a real thing for me that I have seen where, you know, the recruiters who demonstrate that capability and that interest end up going off somewhere else in the function,
Mm.
going off somewhere else in the business. They get picked up and they move into a business partner role, or they move into, a leadership role. So it's the talent strategy around alignment is probably doing a good job of bringing people into our function and developing them with business acumen and that skill set. And maybe it is, acting as a feeder pool to a certain degree. But, in terms of the career recruiter professional, you know, if that's the path, then creating the environment, putting them in the functions that give them the broadest perspective. So I'll give you an example. Um, there are certain functions that lend themselves to broader business acumen than others. So, if you're working as a recruiter in the marketing function, you're going to get a very specific view of the company. Or if you're working as a recruiter um, in R&D, you're going to get a very specific sort of product build view of the company. There are other functions that sort of offer a broader lens on the business environment, like the supply chain or a services business, where they're touching the product, the customer, the accounting, the manufacturing, the end-to-end cycle of how the business actually operates. Those are the functions where, if you're looking to invest in a recruiter with sort of um, a broader lens on the company, those are the functions in your company that are really good for developing acumen, because there's so many aspects of the business that function touches. If you can do that with intentionality, um, it's definitely the right way to do it, as far as I'm concerned. Then maybe move people around in terms of becoming more sort of, SMEs in a particular area. But I think it's a good point where you've got to use org structure as an opportunity to help develop that acumen and be intentional about that. Yeah, definitely.
Brian Ivy, it's been a pleasure having you join us on this topic. I'm so glad you chose this topic. It's what I'm passionate about, have always been. It's not spoken enough of, I think, but hopefully this has been a valuable resource for our listeners as well, to get them thinking about business acumen, the importance, how they can foster that culture, the alignment with their KPIs, enablement, their org structure as well. Brian, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you, getting your insights, and meeting with a fellow old man of recruiting. I only say that, by the way, so someone can correct us, go, "Oh, you're not that old." And I'll go, "Oh, do you really mean that?" Except we are. But it's been great to get to talk to you, Brian. And thanks for joining the show.
Pleasure. Thanks, Johnny.
And that's all. Thank you for listening this week. I hope you really enjoyed that chat about business acumen, made you think about your team, your structure, the way you're educating your team. At Social Talent, we just launched our mini MBA for recruiters to teach business acumen as a skill on the Social Talent platform. If you have access, check it out by searching for mini MBA in your search bar, or you can reach out to the team if you don't have access and get a trial or a demo to see more at socialtalent.com. But until next week, we'll be back again with another Hiring Excellence episode, another great recruiting leader to talk about hiring excellence. Enjoy your week. We'll see you next week.